Thanks for having me. I wish I were there in person. It's much more fun to be able to interact, outside of the screens. But thank you for accommodating this possibility of doing this virtually. I am in Mexico City. I'm at an event that's looking at anti-racism and the connections to gender equality that's organized by UNESCO. So topics quite connected to those of us who care about caring masculinities. I thought what I would do is share some research from the past few years and some reflections from our work, looking at how is it that we're raising boys and how much are we presenting caring versions of masculinity or violent and often emotionally repressed versions of masculinities. And what does that research tell us about some things that we can do? I was pleased when I saw, the topic of this event. I do think that caring masculinities is perhaps the key way forward in our field. I think our conversations about accountability, our conversations about how to improve masculinities have started often from a place of calling men out and calling out the harm, which of course we must do. I'm not saying we should stop doing that, but I think what to fill in men's lives with and the interactions between men and others, I think affirming that we believe it's care that replaces violence and indifference, I think is an affirmation and an area of research that we need to do much more on. So I was pleased really to see the focus of this event and of the work that many of you have been doing. Let me click ahead here. Many of you may previously know us as Equimundo. We changed our name earlier this year as we reflected on kind of how to be in the world, affirm our stance with gender equality, affirm our focus on equity, and also because there's several organizations that we've all grown up together called Equimundo, and we thought it was useful to differentiate ourselves so we weren't kind of centering ourselves as the only group with that name, although we're all partners who have done this work. So some of the studies you'll still see our Equimundo logo on there, but we are now known as Equimundo. First, I'll share a little bit of kind of what's up. How are young men in many parts of the world learning about masculinities? Some of you have probably heard of our man box study, the expression we build upon Paul Kivel's idea of a set of norms that shape men's lives and our interactions with others. We developed an attitude scale from that box, that idea that he came up with in the early 90s. We call it the man box scale. We've validated it now in several countries, working with partners, and it holds up quite well in terms of how men seem to respond to it. We've applied it mostly with young men ages 18 to 25. There's a lot of data here, and I realize I'm going to go kind of quickly over some of it. So I'm not going to go into all the details. All of the data that I'm presenting is on our website, equimundo.org. But I will kind of rush through and try to think about the big issues that come out. As we looked at the literature, as we listened to young men in a number of settings, these are the kind of, there's other things that can go into masculinity in a given setting, but these were the 7 pillars that we found most common. Self-sufficiency, the idea that I have to go it alone, do things for myself, make it on my own. Acting tough, that I've got to show that I'm always in control, that I'm never weak or afraid to step into an issue, a question, a dilemma before me. Physical attractiveness also shows up in there, how men look, how they're seen by others, and we could say that's a little bit of men feeling judged by those around them. What we might call masculine gender roles, who does what at home, who's in charge of sexual relationships, etc. 5, the issue of heterosexuality, homophobia, heteronormativity, still quite alive and often part of a pillar of hegemonic masculinity. Related to that, hypersexuality, a belief that male sexuality is uncontrollable, unstoppable, a natural force, rather than also constructed in our relationships and social context. And related to number 1 and 2, aggression and control, a belief that violence is a normal and acceptable thing to use to resolve problems, and that it is something that men should and in fact are empowered to do. We came up with a number of questions for each of those. That's in the scale that's available on our website. and then applied this in multiple surveys. We've done this in the US, the UK, Mexico, Australia, Ireland, 5 countries in the Caribbean. Some of the questions have been used in some other settings as well. Overall, I won't go into some of the nuances of the questions, but overall, we find that 40 to 50% of men across some quite diverse settings were consistently in the man box. They held up those rigid views that I just shared across the questions that we used. Now, there's both good news and bad news in there. Often, men said others around them, society in general, a female partner, their peer group, their parents, believed more in these views than they did. So there's a lot of men breaking out of these ideas. So I think one conclusion we can say is we spend a lot of energy as society and those around holding up these harmful ideals. Young men grapple with that all the time, and a lot of them are breaking out, but a lot of them, in fact, do follow and do find they get social status and meaning by holding them up. We spend a lot of energy as well, I would say, crushing men's empathy. When we've asked questions about empathy in these same surveys and others, young men feel when they see someone else around them experiencing harm, being bullied, being a victim of homophobic bullying, for example, they feel it. They feel bad, the vast majority. But 89%, just holding up the data from the US, told us they do nothing to intervene in an incident of sexual harassment or bullying because they're worried the violence they're witnessing would come toward them. And I think we know that in terms of how masculinities work, of policing, of telling us, don't question, don't step in. And we as men have a huge experience with violence around us. Some of you may know of our International Men and Gender Equality Survey. This has been carried out in more than 50 countries, inspired in part by the Norwegian Gender Equality and Quality of Life Survey. It's been carried out since 2008, so some of these data sets are from 2008. Some are as recent as last week, where we launched the results in Tunisia. Obviously, the variety of countries, the cultural contexts are quite varied. But just to hold up a few things, and again, I'm going to show some slides that have lots of data points on them, but I'm just going to give some of the big headlines from this data. One of the things we ask in the survey, certainly there's lots of questions about caregiving and caring versions of masculinity, but we also ask about exposure to violence while growing up. And here I'm just showing this, this is rather difficult to read, but what the blue shows is the men who witnessed violence against their mother when they were growing up. The red shows those who themselves experienced physical violence from parents, male peers, others around them. And the purple is the percent of men who experience both of those forms of violence. So if you look at the bottom, it's got the numbers there. That's rather difficult to read, I know. But what I want to say here is from numbers that range from 30% to 80% of men in very, very diverse contexts around the world witness or experience violence growing up. We have other surveys carried out by others on the experiences of violence growing up, and we know that boys tend to experience more physical violence. Witnessing of violence is about equal between men and women growing up across the world. But in terms of experiencing physical violence, we as men, typically, vast majority of us experience some of that growing up. We spend a lot of time in the raising boys. Sorry, I moved to the wrong direction there. Spending a lot of time using violence against boys, teaching them in the process that it's acceptable. Not surprisingly, our data finds that boys who witness violence are 3 times more likely on average, again, across cultural settings, to use violence against a female partner if they witnessed it growing up. The strongest protective factor for those who witnessed it and don't go on to carry out violence against a female partner, where we don't see that transmission of violence, is having a caring, involved male caregiver. Now, this in no way says that that's the only thing. The next strongest factor is when there was some intervention in that violence, that is, someone did something, often a woman, to say this is not okay, sought help, and was able to break the cycle that way. But those two things, both women being empowered to speak out against male violence and seeing other versions, particularly having an involved male caregiver who was not someone who was the one who carried out violence, shows up consistently as a protective factor. Also want to talk about how other factors drive more caring masculinity. We ask the question and look at which men show more equitable, connected, compassion versions of masculinities. Two factors showed up a lot. If you had a male, whether that was your father or another man in the household, who was supportive and very involved in care work, and if you had a mother who worked outside the home. These two factors, as we look across so many settings, and again, it's reducing all the reduction that quantitative data analysis does. But the higher the number here shows a more positive, gender equitable and connected version of masculinity versus a less connected. So if you both had a father or a male caregiver who was involved in caring for you and a mother who was working outside the home as one indicator of her empowerment or equality compared to a male partner, you had a significantly higher gravitation toward equitable attitudes, caring and connected attitudes about masculinities. We also see a rather obvious transmission, and again, this holds up across cultures. I realize that's got a lot of data points there. The more that your father or another male did hands-on caregiving at home, the more likely you were to carry it out. So again, big headlines. If you saw growing up violent versions of masculinities, you are more likely to use it. If you saw caring versions of masculinity, you're more likely to grow into those. Tells us just how much these early years matter in passing on ideas of healthy masculinities. More recently, we've been looking at the online world of boys. We've carried out 3 studies in the last 2 years in partnership with the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, applying the man box, so using those same questions and pillars of masculinity, and looking at the content of the media that boys and young men consume. One of those studies, we looked at the television that boys ages 8 to 13 are watching in the US. One of those, we looked at the most popular television shows and looked at how male caregiving was portrayed. And one of those, we took the most popular gaming streaming platform, Twitch, and we looked at the masculine content or the masculinities content, of the 10 most played games. Those games mostly played by men, all 10 of the streamers, those are those who lead that gaming and the watching that you do as the participant, all of those male, all of those self-defined as heterosexual. We looked at the content of the game they were playing, as well as the content of the streaming, of the chat box. There's a lot of data in all those studies. Those are on our website, but I'll just again give some headlines. Looking at what the television that boys are watching, they're about as likely to see female characters speaking and in roles as protagonists that they are to see males. They are seeing women as competent. They are seeing women as leaders. Now, if we look at, however, at how they're seeing men, they're less likely to see men as competent caregivers, less likely to see men in hands-on parenting. They're more likely to see men doing traditional kinds of jobs. They're more likely as well to see, I jumped ahead there. They're more likely as well, this isn't on the slide here, more likely as well to see men using violence to resolve problems and to see men as mostly emotionally incompetent, that is not able to express their emotions in healthy, clearly communicated ways. There's a lot more to unpack in that study, but I wanted to offer that just as some headlines. In terms of the gaming study, and I'll just go back, this one called The Double-Edged Sword, we should be very frightened about the gaming content that boys and girls are watching, to call it that. There's a huge amount of misogyny, of homophobia, and racist language in the chats. When the streamers use that language, we saw that those who are the spectators, their use of that language increased significantly. The majority of the games, more than 75%, were about killing of others. Most of that killing in the games played on Twitch is white male characters killing others for no self-defense reasons, simply for the sheer thrill of that kind of gaming. Very little participation by streamers in calling out harmful language. At the same time, we found, and this is disturbing or perhaps positive, 3/4, we did a separate national survey in the US of men, young men, and their game watching, and the vast majority said they found a sense of community in their gaming. And in fact, they felt that that was where they could be their most authentic selves. So we have to be quite concerned if we think that is the space with that kind of language and those versions of masculinities being portrayed, that this is where they find themselves being their authentic selves. Now, we don't have the qualitative research we'd like to go with that. We think we do have to be careful of just thinking that boys are certainly not passive recipients of that information. And in fact, we saw just how much they're responsive to what happens. If there's positive language portrayed, they're often likely to switch into that. So there's a lot of performing going on of masculinities and a lot of micro context, to call it that. So I don't want to present this as somehow TV is determining and boys are watching it in very passive ways. They're making meaning of it, and they're often being critical of it, but we do need to be concerned. We've used that data to try to have conversations, and that's where engaging with the Gina Davis Institute is interesting, because they have contacts with content makers. We've done workshops with them on what's happening there, trying to encourage them, calling them out to try to do more. Thought I would also bring up the issue of the connection. I'm looking at time here, got just a few more minutes, of how men are caring for themselves. Looking at how we care for others and how we care for ourselves. We did a study during COVID of men's self-care and the connection of that self-care and care for others. The kinds of care that we as adult men do in the US that is most common in terms of caring for ourselves is physical. The physical activity, body care, that men do on an average of 4 times a week. Emotional and mental care, that is, do you take some time to meditate, to think about how you're doing, to read something that inspires you? Still quite frequently, but not as high, 3 times a week. When we ask questions about, do you reach out to others when you're feeling down or when you feel the need to connect? During COVID, this was the least likely to happen, just 2 times a week. What we did find is that if men are attuned to our own needs, and particularly our emotional needs, we're more likely to care for others. So this bar shows more or less if you did physical care at the higher end, you did some more caring for your aging parents. If you were more connected to others or cared for yourself, you were more likely to do multiple forms of care. Again, fairly obvious. If men are attuned to the fact that we're emotional beings that need support and care, that we obviously need physical care, but we also need to care for how we connect with others, for how we're feeling, for when we may be feeling down or anxious or fearful, that we need help with that. We seem to be more compassionate and connected and caring of others. Useful to think as well about that we do need to, in a way, give men and boys permission to care for themselves as we call them to be more caring for others. Did a piece of research that is leading to our global boyhood initiative that we did with the US, and we've just applied this as well in France, and we're carrying this out in Mexico, where I am at the moment working with our partners, looking at parents and their concerns about their sons. This study is also on our website. I'm not going to go into many details, but it was disturbing that nearly 50% of parents think that their sons are uncomfortable showing love. Very higher rates of other things of showing that they're lonely or scared. But as we think about caring and connection, that half of parents think that their sons, these are random sample of parents of sons, mothers and fathers and other caregivers of sons in the US, sons ages 8 to 13. Quite disturbing that nearly 50% said, my son is uncomfortable showing love. I happen to feel that's perhaps the strongest and most important emotion that we need to be able to share, and quite disturbing that parents said that. Parents perceiving and often being part of the construction of emotionally repressive versions of manhood, believing that their sons have to show they're physically strong, that he wants to do sports, that he has to fit in, he has to be emotionally strong, which when we did the testing of that, it meant stoic essentially, that he's got to act typically male. They feel that he perceives that pressure. We asked them separately if they believed in those things, and the majority did. So I want to end on this one. What do we do with this? We should be quite disturbed about how we're raising our sons. It's not that we're necessarily doing good jobs of creating safe spaces and empowered worlds and opportunities for our daughters, but we should be worried about how much energy goes into and effort goes into and creation of meaning in the lives of boys that is about repressing our caring empathetic selves. One, we believe that very obviously we need to have intentional and compassionate conversations about masculinity, to build that into work in schools and in media, in mass media, hence our conversations with colleagues who are connected in the world of Hollywood and that content creation. But we need to make it deliberate. It's not simply calling out the harm, that we're going to have those intentional conversations about what we want in caring masculinity. There's a huge amount to be done, secondly, around caregiving. This is not to say that, every boy needs a father or needs a male role model around. I do not believe that's the case. But I do believe we need to talk a lot more. And I think the efforts, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of Europe, where there's been more participation by men in the daily care of children, is something that needs to be global. But it's not only being present, it is how we are present as male caregivers and female caregivers in making healthy masculinities with our sons. Third, I think we have to acknowledge the trauma and mental health issues in men's lives. The violence we experience growing up is traumatic. There's different levels of trauma, and I don't want to overuse that term, but I do think we look at boys' lives with more empathy and compassion if we acknowledge that our exposure, our witnessing of and our experiencing of violence is a traumatic experience. Fourth, as I hinted at before, I think we need to think about men's self-care. It is a pathway to us being more careful of others. And I think that's something to think about. And finally, I do think it's important to step into believing that we come into the world wanting to be empathetic and caring, that is where we start from, and that our work is about helping boys and men be their best selves, be their best caring and respectful selves. We also do a lot of work on care policies. Many of you know about our Men Care campaign, and we've come up with a set of recommendations. I'm mindful of time, so I am going to move off of that. That is part of our last State of the World's Fathers report, of thinking about how we get governments to not only do the parental leave policies and national care policies, but Action 5 is about how do we create an ethic of male care in schools and media, sports spaces, the places where we make boyhood. We need to deliberately have in place policies that promote an ethic of male care. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. We need to make it something that boys see, that we want and expect of them, that we teach and model. I mentioned earlier, we've started a new initiative that we're building some new research with partners in a number of countries, trying to say, what would it look like to put into the world this idea of an ethic of healthy, connected boyhood? Doing work with partners to gather some research with parents and with boys, looking at the media that boys are consuming, and then working together with partners both around programmatic interventions, but also looking at how do we put in the media different social messaging around boyhood. We're just starting this work, so I don't have much to share except from that research that's framing it, but really trying to step into that question of how do we present an ethic of care to boys ages 4 to 12. And I'll stop with this, which is, we asked at the beginning of COVID boys in both a conservative Republican voting families and also more progressive voting families in the US, how they describe good manhood, whether we use the word good, sometimes we use good or not, but it didn't really matter. Both sets, conservative or more progressive, had very positive words to say about what being a man meant. There were few that said, I have to carry a gun and cause harm to people. They were positive words. So we have to ask, these were boys ages 9 to 11. So I think we have some reason to be hopeful that in spite of all that we do to bombard boys with harmful ideas, there's a huge amount of resistance and resilience that I think we need to draw on. And I want to end on that hopeful note, because there's a lot of production of the negative views about masculinity, but I think we have to have deep faith that boys and girls with our support can become the caring, connected, helpful, kind, nice, respectful, the words they used, that exists there. We're not making this up. We're not teaching them to be something that they don't already perceive as valuable. I will stop there for a few comments, and thanks for inviting me to share these reflections.
Yeah, it's on. Thank you very much, Gary. I'm supposed to look at the camera, but I feel like I should look back because that's where Gary is. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. This is a unique opportunity, and I suggest you use that. Please raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Or comments. Comments are also welcome.
Hi, so I'm Victoria and I'm from Caritas. Oh, yes, here's the camera. Yeah,
Fine.
sorry. So I had a question. You talked about like media and like gaming. What about the ads? Because like there's a lot of them, and that's really the place where you can like can't control it. Because as a parent, maybe you can filter out some, I don't know, movies, maybe some games, but what to do with ads when they are everywhere, even on the streets, in like, I don't know, in the movies, in TV, it's everywhere. And that's the place where like toxic masculinity like
Yeah.
flourishes, because like there's a lot talk about like man is strong, man is not supposed to cry. If you use this doesn't like this thing, you will be strong and cool. So what, I don't know, like what's the solution for ads, and how can we even like control how kids see them?
Yeah.
Because like, yeah, I don't know, maybe you have like some ideas.
I mean,
Or
yeah, I think it's a, I mean, I need to confess from the beginning, I'm not a media studies expert. We have partnered with media studies experts. And I think what we've often done, as we do, too often as social science researchers, is we go for the data that's easiest to gather. There are data on which television shows and which streaming is most watched by different age segments and by sex. So you can find data in the US and many countries around which TV and streaming is most common. You can find that about gaming as well. You can look at which films had the most watch. So those are easier, whereas the ad world, because it happens in so many spaces, it's far more difficult to do this kind of quantitative analysis that we did. What we're stepping into is some qualitative research next year with young men and kind of who they perceive as sources of influence. So rather than just using the quantitative data we can find, to start from you telling us what you watch and where you get your cues from it. The other piece, I think you're absolutely right about ads. The challenge, of course, from studying them is just like they now show up on, any screen that goes into hold. There's 14 things happening there. It's really, it is so ubiquitous that it's really hard to measure. The other space that we want to look at is influencers. We're looking at Andrew Tate and his 10 million plus followers, or Jordan Peterson and his 3 million plus followers, Joe Rogan. I'm mentioning US and Canadian ones, but there are many others. And again, to step into that, and it's not just the negative masculinities and how many folks follow, but I think we have to look at the meaning that men make of it. I was just with some boys in a school in the UK 3 weeks back, where we're testing a methodology for questioning harmful masculinities. And many of the boys could talk about looking at Andrew Tate, and we looked on with a certain horror about what he represents. But many times they could look and say, well, I like this because he gives me some ideas on how I can work on building up my body, but he's kind of stupid when he talks about girls. So I think, we also have to believe that 12 and 13-year-old and younger boys and girls can come into looking at media in critical ways. And I think we've got to look at where it's probably impossible. I think we do need more kinds of controls on what boys are watching, ads as well. But I think we need to do more research on kind of the meaning that boys are making out of that. Sorry, that was a long response and probably answered an additional question, but you provoked me on where we've been thinking of where to go next with this.
Thank you, Gary. We have another comment in the back there, right?
Hello, Gary. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed you talking with empathy for boys and men. I really agree with you that there's a lot of trauma in men, and we're not talking enough about that. Maybe you could comment more about the best initiatives or practices that you see for working with men and trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking that. We did a we did a long literature review and consulted some experts in the trauma field. There's a paper that's on our website, and I can share that link. You know, a few things to to think about. One, we know that levels of trauma, depression, most mental health issues show up as much in men as they do in women, depending on the data set we're looking at. Partly, one of the biggest challenges is creating a safe space for men to say that was traumatic for me, and to acknowledge and be able to have the emotional language to talk about it. That is both in men and boys who have experienced trauma, and it's in those of us who are service providers in creating that safe space to acknowledge trauma that men have faced. And I think we see that whether it's experiencing sexual violence growing up or as adults, whether it's witnessing violence at home, is creating within the service sector, those of us who should be providing services to men and boys, the space that says we can acknowledge, you can talk about, you are safe sharing that with me. I think the models that we've seen most effective, we have looked and helped support, build some models in post-conflict settings. Perhaps in some of the settings where trauma is the worst, I think there's been some very creative psychologists. We've been blessed to partner with a group called the Living Peace Institute in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, in the eastern region. And colleagues there, looking at the impact of 2 decades of conflict, came up with a model that's about building support, group support, where men can talk about trauma. And where about 1/3 of the members in the group are individuals who show higher coping skills, men like them, who, when they face similar traumas, have shown higher coping skills. So there's a peer influence of me being with men like me, who show higher coping, if you want to call it that, in the face of trauma and adverse life experiences, and to be able to learn in a setting like that from other individuals who show higher coping. I know often in our work with men who have used violence against women, for example, we're only putting men who have used violence against women together with often 1 or 2 facilitators. And we think it's really important to show kind of men who do have some good strategies for how they have dealt with adversity and trauma. So one would be just answering simply your question, making it visible how men express and experience trauma, being able more aware as mental health professionals, particularly of how men express trauma. Men's depression is more often expressed as violence. And I think we have trouble acknowledging that men's expression of violence, while we want to call them out, is often also an expression of trauma or depression. And third, I would say that lesson around when we do group interventions, to do them in ways that include some higher coping individuals. That's not the language we use in the group setting, but it's what we, as those who design those groups, try to do with them. I hope that's useful. I think it's a field that needs much more work.
Thank you, Gary. The camera was on me, but I can tell you that there was nodding and affirmation that it was useful indeed. I am mindful of time, though. I believe that if we were to go on, I assume there would be more points of discussion, but we have limited time. Thank you very much, Gary, for being here. My vowels and consonants are getting a bit messier as it's afternoon for me, Gary. It's not morning, it's afternoon. I've been doing this for quite some time. So thank you for being here. I hope you stay on for another hour while we have our panel discussion if you have the time. Everyone, I think another round of applause for Gary.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be able to connect.